This week on the Communicators, a look at potential telecommunications and technology policy in the 112th Congress. Our guests are former Hill staffers Tricia Paoletta and Catherine McCullough.
Well, with the new Congress in place and new leadership in power, we thought we'd take this opportunity on the Communicators to look at telecommunications policy and the 112th Congress. Joining us are two former congressional staff members. Tricia Paoletta was a majority counsel in the House of Representatives for the Republicans in the 1990s, and Catherine McCullough was the former Senate Commerce Counsel on the Democratic side. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate it. Joining us also is Juliana Grunwald, Tech Daily Dose editor of the National Journal. Catherine McCullough, if I could start with you. You wrote in a recent blog in comlawblog.com that you look for two things: a high degree of activity on telecommunications policy in the upcoming Congress and a high degree of cooperation. Why did you write that?
I think that there's going to be a high degree of cooperation on certain issues. For instance, TV spectrum allocation when it comes to the idea of deciding on authority for incentive auctions and who's going to get what slice of the pie. I think that there's a lot of incentive to work together on those issues because it's going to mean extra money for the Treasury, which of course means that that money can be used to either lower the deficit or be put to other programs.
Do you, Tricia Paoletta, see cooperation in the upcoming Congress on telecommunications policy, and do you see them acting on a lot of different issues?
Well, personally, I think the minority party always calls for cooperation. I think that's traditional. But I mean, certainly there is a lot of common ground on spectrum policy and the need to rationalize the rules on spectrum auctions. So I think there will be some of that. The priority coming out of the box, at least on the House Republican side, is to do some very close scrutiny of the net neutrality decision that just came out from the FCC. And both Chairman Upton and Chairman Walden have called for review of that, have called for hearings with the full commission, and also potential joint resolutions of disapproval, which will be a little more challenging coming out from the Senate, but to look at that very closely. And I think because that was a very party line vote out of the FCC very recently, there's a bit of a partisan feeling opening in this Congress. So we'll get to cooperation, I think, down the road, but first there'll be very close review of the net neutrality decision.
Catherine McCullough, your views on Chairman Walden, the incoming subcommittee chair, and the net neutrality issue?
Well, I think that he stated his views very clearly. He issued the release with Chairman Upton and also with Lee Terry. And I think that my colleague here is right. I think that there's going to be a lot of review of that early on. And I think that a lot of the action, once the initial flurry goes on in Congress, I mean, the divide there is pretty well defined. So I think the next thing we're going to see, of course, is the next bit of action happening in the courts. And I think it's very interesting that even though everyone seems to be divided on this issue and very far apart on what should occur and what neutrality should look like, everyone is in agreement that a delay in determining the playing field hurts everyone. And yet I think that, that's of course what court action is going to mean.
Both of our guests are telecommunications lawyers and still involved in telecommunications policies following their stints on Capitol Hill. Juliana Grunwald with Tech Daily Dose.
Do you see tech and telecom policy issues playing a prominent role in the House GOP agenda?
Well, absolutely, because it's widely agreed, and this is Senate and House and, of course, Republican and Democrat, that technology is the growth engine for our economy and our international competitiveness. So I do think it will play quite a big role. I mean, clearly the House GOP has announced that its priority is health care repeal, so that's going to take a lot of energy, and then, of course, after that is energy. But, I mean, telecommunications is important, and because, as Kathleen mentioned, there is a lot of broad agreement on what needs to be done. I mean, not quite how to do it, but what needs to be done. I think, once you clear through those other issues, you are going to see some focus. Certainly Chairman Upton has a long track record in telecommunications policy. He chaired that subcommittee earlier on, so he understands telecom. Greg Walden is a former broadcaster from early days, and And I think I read recently he's one of the few licensed ham operators, amateur radio operators, which is, kind of a specialized niche. So he understands spectrum, understands the importance of it. So I think it will become it will be a big issue in this Congress.
Now, he hasn't really, Mr. Walden hasn't really outlined his agenda. In addition to net neutrality, what else do you see him acting, or what other priorities do you see for him?
Well, certainly universal service reform. He comes from a rural state. That's a very important issue for rural residents. To get to all services, and to the extent there's higher costs in rural areas, you do need some kind of subsidization. And the debate recently has been about reforming the program to cover broadband subsidies. So I think that's going to be an issue. He's actually bringing on as one of his staffers somebody who chaired the state regulatory group on universal service. So I think that will be an issue. And certainly the vice chairman of the subcommittee, Lee Terry, has had a long-standing interest in universal service reform, as has Chairman Rockefeller. So I think you are going to see that be a focus too.
But speaking of Chairman Rockefeller, will he push USF reform in this Congress, and do you see it happening?
I don't know if I see it happening. Chairman Rockefeller is very interesting that he is very consumer-oriented in the avenues that he pursues. So on the one hand, the argument could be made that if USF is reformed, bills will go down, and that's a consumer angle that Chairman Rockefeller could pursue. On the other hand, he also comes from a rural state. He's very concerned about getting good service for West Virginia. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I actually think that one of the key players in USF will probably be someone like Senator DeMint, who is on the committee, of course, has some very sharp staff who know how to really get their way around telecom issues, but also, he's a fiscal conservative, and he is against, in principle, kind of, waste. And I think that you can maybe look to him for some leadership on how this issue is going to play out.
Is USF, why is it such a money issue?
Well, depending on how you look at it, you have shall we say, entrenched interests in the states that receive money for the services they perform. And so if you're a senator, and obviously you're interested in your state interests, and then you also have the national interest to consider about this national program and how to broaden it to take in new technologies, you're in kind of you have kind of a Hobson's choice there. So it's going to be interesting.
And it's a money issue because in a competitive industry, it's quite a burden on carriers who are actually contributing into the fund. The FCC sets the contribution factor. It's an interesting word, but it's a mandatory payment, a percentage of their interstate revenues. And of late, it's gone to historically high levels. 15%, or over 15%, of interstate revenues are supposed to be paid into this fund that an entity working under the FCC's governance pays out to eligible carriers to help expand service. But 15% is quite a high number, and not all carriers are subject to it because of foibles of FCC regulation on internet. And so you're also seeing less and less people really participate, and then more of the traffic is growing and moving on to internet platforms. And so it's becoming more and more of an issue, more acute. So it's a lot of money involved, and there's a lot of competitive distortions involved. So this may be the year it gets done.
Lee Terry, you mentioned Lee Terry. He had drafted a bill in the previous Congress with former Congressman Rick Boucher to reform USF. And he recently told me that he was looking for a Democratic partner to work with him in the 112th Congress. Do you see any likely Democrats that would work with him on that? And if not, do you see the FCC acting, and do they have the authority to do what needs to be done on their own?
Yeah, and I understand the Democrats are still organizing their subcommittee leadership, so I don't know who's going to sort of take those roles on. But I think there's plenty of Democrat members who might be interested, because it's an important issue, and particularly as the fund may move to cover broadband. So I think there's a number of members who might step up to do that. But so it is an issue. And what was the second part?
The FCC, could they act?
Oh yeah, yes, they have stated that they have authority to reform the fund. And the language from the '96 Act was fairly broad to give them power to amend it for advanced services.
Well, do you see them acting? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yes, I do see them acting. In fact, they're going to act one piece of it in February. It's already on their agenda.
Question for both of you. Catherine McCullough, we'll start with you. Where does congressional legislative power end and FCC authority start?
I think everybody wishes they knew the answer to that question, and I think that the courts are going to be the ultimate arbiters, of course, as they usually are. And I find it very interesting culturally that both Congress and the administration tend to ignore the courts a little bit until they're pretty far down the road and the courts, come down with a hammer. So, for instance, that's it's a very important question when it comes to net neutrality. And as I said, we're going to be going to the courts over that issue. I think it'll be, interesting to see how it comes out. I'm not so sure that the courts are going to give the FCC what they want.
And picking up on that, I earlier in my career, before I went to Congress, I actually worked at the FCC. So I took to heart the provision in the Communications Act that basically says the FCC can do whatever it wants in order to regulate interstate communications. And of course, then I went up to Congress, and then it's a different story. And the Commerce committees are actually unusual committees in that their role is spelled out in the Constitution, which is not very typical. I don't know if there's other committees, maybe one or two, but the ability to regulate interstate commerce is spelled out in the Constitution and given to the Commerce committees, and it's that authority that is delegated, by, expressly in the Communications Act to the FCC. So there is always that yin and yang as to how much discretion the FCC has to fill in the blanks of what's not actually in the Communications Act, and that is the debate that Kathleen's alluded to in terms of net neutrality. And I wanted to pick up on one other point you made earlier in terms of Mr. Walden's priorities. I do think he'll be looking at the broadband stimulus funds that have been allocated. 2 years ago, at the beginning of the last Congress, there was a lot of money, about $7 billion allocated to commerce and to agriculture to help stimulate broadband. And a lot of that money has gone out the door, and I think this Congress, and presumably on the Senate side as well, will be looking at how that money was spent.
And I think Chairman Issa will also be looking at that issue.
Yes, he will.
Speaking of Darrell Issa, his name is starting to pop up quite a bit when it comes to telecommunications policy. Do you see him playing a role in moving some of these issues forward or stopping some of these issues?
I do. I mean, like Greg Walden, he has a technical background, and I think he's one of the few members of Congress that hold patents. He has a number of them. So I think he is interested, and of course he represents a district in California where Silicon Valley and tech entrepreneurs obviously have a lot of political influence. So yes, I think he will be, just from his district's concerns and his own background, he will be interested in that.
I was talking with a member of his subcommittee staff this morning, and it turns out that he is going to be going for 7 hearings a week between, yes, that's a lot of energy. And so I think that he is very serious in his, in his determination to, review programs and to look at where government's role is and should be.
Of course, he has sent letters to industry associations, including those in the communication sector, saying, tell us, what regulatory programs are undermining job growth, undermining innovation. So he already has stepped into that space.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. We're discussing the 112th Congress and telecommunications policy. Our guests, Tricia Paoletta, former Majority Counsel on the House side from 2003 to 2006, and Catherine McCullough, former Senate Commerce Committee Counsel on the Democratic side in the 1990s. Juliana Grunwald is the editor of Tech Daily Dose of the National Journal.
Verizon executive Tom Taki, a former congressman, said yesterday that his firm would like to see Congress revisit the 1996 Telecom Act. Do you see that happening? Could some of these net neutrality, these FCC authority issues be clarified with a rewrite of the Telecom Act?
I think certainly last year there was a lot of talk about rewriting the act, and I don't think that's going to happen too early on in this Congress, because you have a lot of new members who don't have the decades of experience that some of the departing members had. So I think you might, towards the second half of the year, start getting into hearings to help educate those members. But I don't see that happening early on because of the other priorities, including net neutrality, they'll want to get through.
I agree. I think that because of the factors that were just mentioned here, and also because you have this situation where nobody is fully in the majority, nobody feels full control. I think that the first focus is going to be on oversight hearings and on investigating specific matters. And when things calm down, then I think that you might be able to see a chance of having kind of contemplative discussions and gatherings of people who want to look at different sections of the act. And there was some talk about that happening last Congress. And when these committees are going to get all this time to go and kind of rationally pick apart the Telecom Act, I don't know exactly when that's going to be, but I don't think that it would be in the early part of this next Congress.
Where do you see the Senate and the House working together on what issues? And you mentioned spectrum, but are there other areas that you see, Senate Democrats and House Republicans working together on?
Well, you go ahead.
That's right. I do. I think, for instance, there's going to be some kind of baseline privacy legislation worked out. I think that the issue of privacy has ripened certainly from when I worked on it several years ago. The technologies have kind of come to fruition, and these definitions of what should be regulated, people are kind of coming to more of a consensus about that. And then in the marketplace, it seems as though there might be a necessity for it. For instance, we hear about Facebook, possibly going public. That has tremendous implications for all of our private information, and it's difficult to see how a company like Facebook can make promises to its investors when it doesn't quite know how all the information that it has can be used. And so it'll probably be useful for that field to become clear so that investment can go forward.
Do you see Congress blessing the idea of a do not track mechanism that the FTC has called for in their draft privacy report released in December?
Possibly, I think after hearings, though. I mean, the committees moved very quickly once there was the do not call list. That legislation moved very quickly. So, and often, Congress is reactive. If there is some privacy catastrophe, certainly they will move very quickly on that. Another area I think of possible joint interest will be on public safety spectrum. There's and part of that will be because Representative King, who is the incoming chair, or the new chairman of House Homeland Security, and Senator Rockefeller share an interest in how to allocate new spectrum for public safety, for an interoperable network. And I think their approach differs somewhat from the House Energy and Commerce chair. And so if they do introduce legislation on what's called D block, it's 10 megahertz of spectrum, that might put some pressure on House Commerce to react to that.
Catherine McCullough, on the opposite side of that coin, where do you see the Senate and the House maybe butting heads?
That's an interesting question. The Senate and the House work together, at least on the Commerce committees, more than in many other committees on each side of the aisle. The telecom world tends to be small and people tend to know each other. So, a lot of the disagreement that you see, even though, you see opposing letters being sent and that kind of thing, actually when that's going on, sometimes there are talks going on behind the scenes as well. So, I mean, certainly you're going to see it, of course, on net neutrality, the way that the D's and the R's are divided. And I'm sure that you'll find it over issues such as USF reform and that kind of thing too. But we'll see. I think that, again, over these consumer issues, like privacy, you're apt to see a bit more coming together. And also on issues, like I said, in the blog, where there are money issues, where it looks like money can come into the Treasury, you're going to see a lot of cooperation from a lot of different places.
Coming from the D side of the aisle, as you do, were you relieved when Fred Upton became chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee?
What a question. I did think that he was a good candidate for it. I wouldn't put it up as relief. I think I'm glad that he's the chairman, and I'm glad that Congressman Walden will also be there. I think that he has a lot of good insight. I think that the important thing is for these committees and subcommittees to be held by people who have some kind of understanding of these highly technical areas. I think that that helps everyone come to consensus and create laws that make sense for everyone.
Tricia Paoletta, Fred Upton is chairman, coming from the Republican side of the aisle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and as a telecom lawyer and lobbyist, I'm thrilled that he's there because he does understand the issues. And in terms of sort of Republican principles and governance, he has always articulated a preference for a reliance on, market solutions and letting technology involved. Don't come up with an answer to fix a problem that isn't really there. So I think that gives a lot of comfort to folks in industry, across the board in the different sectors of communications.
Getting back to privacy, who do you see being leading players on that? In the House, Joe Barton has been outspoken on the need for privacy legislation. Who do you see sort of stepping up to the plate in the House on that issue, and who do you see stepping up to the plate on that issue in the Senate?
Well, I think in the House side they'll take a measured view and look at the issues, hold some hearings. I think there's somewhat of a difference in approach to privacy. So I don't think you're going to see anyone initially jumping into that and leading the banner and saying that this is a priority, but perhaps looking at it in a more measured approach.
Do you see Bobby Rush's bill being at all a starting point in the House? And he may very well be the ranking member on the telecom subcommittee.
I think there'll be discussions on that, but I don't see that the verbatim that bill being the vehicle that one of the Republican members introduces.
Okay.
I think that the Boucher-Stearns bill that was, the discussion draft was issued during the last Congress. I think that that could serve as a basis. And I think that that bill combined with Mr. Rush's bill could serve as a basis. I mean, I think one of the important things about Representative Boucher was that he understood these issues very well. His staff understood these issues very well. And he worked together with Mr. Stearns very well. And so I think that what you had come out of there was a pretty strong indication of what a baseline privacy bill will look like. And I think, when you see a bill come out, and I do think that bill will come out, it will be a baseline approach in order to attract Republican votes. And then there will also be some kind of elements of industry self-regulation, which, of course, the industry has been doing for many years now.
If you would, for just a second, reflect on the loss of Mr. Boucher to the Congress and to telecommunications policy.
I was obviously disappointed. I thought that he was terrific. I thought his staff was good. Again, I like his consensus approach. But I think that, again, if Congressman Rush comes in, I think that he'll probably take lessons from Mr. Boucher's chairmanship and probably do the same thing in terms of seeking consensus.
Catherine McCullough, in the last Congress, or it seems like the last two Congresses, so much of the attention has been on the Energy and Commerce Committee and not on the Senate side. Is that reflective of Senator Rockefeller's leadership for whatever reason, or is it just because E&C has that vibrancy?
Vibrancy is a good word for it. I think part of it is a matter of jurisdiction. Of course, on the House side, E&C has health care, and on the Senate side, it does not. It's split off into a separate committee. So I think that that has a great deal to do with it. The Commerce Committee on the Senate side has always been kind of reserved in some ways. They like to have consensus, for instance, in their committee votes. They don't like to have they don't have a history of liking to have a lot of stuff play out in the press usually. The two sides of the two staffs get along very well. They certainly did when I was there. We were directed under no uncertain terms to work it out, as my chairman told me. Of course, Senator Inouye and Senator Stevens called each other brother. They called each other co-chair. So, on the Senate side, there's a definite cultural issue working there that, of course, you don't have in the House often because, the House is all about rules that allow the majority, even with one vote, to ram something through, and the Senate is all about the minority, even with one vote, stopping something from going through. So you're much more incentivized on the Senate side to find consensus.
Tricia Paoletta, same question.
Why is the House more vibrant? Because the House is, of course. But, Some of it is personality driven, and Catherine alluded to the close relationship between some of the senators, and so I think I'll leave it at that. But yeah, but well, no, I will add. I mean, some of the more recent chairmen are big personalities, so I think you've seen that through the culture.
Juliana Grunwald.
One area where Senator Kerry, who's the chairman of the Communications Subcommittee on the Commerce Committee in the Senate, was very vocal last year, was on this issue of retransmission disputes between broadcasters and cable companies. Now, do you see Congress getting into that, or do you think they'll defer to the FCC now that the FCC has indicated that they may do a rulemaking on that?
Media issues always tend to get a lot of interest in Congress, and for a variety of reasons. So I think, yes, certainly it's not a priority right now, but certainly that will get some bandwidth down the road.
Yeah, I think that if the FCC does not take care of it, and particularly when you're getting closer to the elections, that's one of those kind of consumer issues that resonate with the voters, that all of a sudden, the dark horse, the issue comes up, and all of a sudden it gets resolved and gets a lot of attention.
Media ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Will that be addressed in the 112th Congress? Will the rules be changed? Do they need to be changed?
Do they need to be changed?
Updated for today's telecommunications world?
I don't see it being a hot button issue. I mean, of course, the review's going to be the review, but I think that with everything else on the agenda in terms of congressional action, there are more things ahead of it on the agenda.
And there was some concern expressed last Congress by some of the Republican members that with some of the FCC's proposals that perhaps given cuts in journalism budgets by media companies that the government must fund the media, and I think that causes a lot of concern. And actually, Chairman Walden, now Chairman Walden, and Representative Pence introduced a bill on addressing some of those issues. So certainly I think in Congress, at least on the House Republican side, there will be close monitoring of the FCC's proposals on that, and if necessary, there will be legislation introduced if they are concerned with some of those proposals.
You mentioned that legislation. I think it dealt with the fairness doctrine, and that's been an issue of interest for Mr. Walden. Do you see him pushing that legislation in the 112th Congress? I mean, the FCC hasn't made any moves in that area.
I think because he's now chair that he won't do anything unless it's necessary, right? Chairmen tend to hold back and wait to see what's important before they put their chop on the line. But as necessary.
Final question. With today's telecommunications world, are the rules governing it outdated at this point? Would you like to see an overhaul of the Telecommunications Acts?
I think that there does need to be at least an examination of several issues. If this net neutrality issue can't get worked out in a consensus fashion reasonably quickly, then I think that is perhaps a reason to open up larger issues. Again, it's kind of been talked about for a while. That is the difficulty with telecom policy, is that you have these technologies that are continually changing, and it's difficult to kind of hit the moving target when it comes to making sure the government is being responsible to its voters.
And for your viewers, the Communications Act is divided by sector, and of course we are seeing more and more convergence in the real world. You've got tablets, and which is a convergence of a lot of different technologies. You have video on your tablet. It's over a device where you can also speak. It almost looks like a cell phone. So, and currently those different content and services are regulated by different bureaus within the Commission. So there is a challenge, but. And who's going to drive that is the central question, because as we've heard from some members, it's Congress that should be developing the strategy and the policy, and not the FCC. And of course, from the Commission, they say, well, convergence is happening, we have to react to it. So, there's a continuous, pressure and challenge there, and we're going to have to see how that plays out.
And if you would, in closing, give us a thumbnail of your current work and the type of clients you work with.
Well, at Wiltshire Granis, it's a telecom technology law firm. We also have a litigation side, and we tend to represent folks in the technology space as well as wireless entities, providers and vendors, and some cable, broadband, no broadcasters. We love them, but Too many issues.
Catherine McCullough.
I do represent broadcasting and also several wireless interests.
Catherine McCullough and Tricia Paoletta have been our guests on the Communicators. Juliana Grunwald, Tech Daily Dose, thank you as well.